The first question you always need to ask a futurist is, have you outlived your forecasts? We're usually right in the sense that we actually keep track. Out of those 50 years, 60 to 80% of our forecasted futures have actually happened. The 10 skills, I think, are the skills we need, but skills aren't enough. It also takes literacies or practices or discipline, and that's the second book. And the third book is mindset, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Introduce dilemma flipping, and a dilemma is a problem you can't solve. It won't go away, but you have to figure out how to win anyway, and you have to take your fear, simulate it, game it, and then allow people to immerse themselves in it. So the military, again, it's way ahead of us in business. They call this wargaming. And
we are very honored to have Bob Johansen, who's a very senior futurist, join us from the Institute for the Future, which is a think tank which has been around for about 50 years. The area of futures thinking is something very new in India. And the goal of the Global Leadership Seminar is to bring the best of management wisdom from around the world to Indian companies and Indian startups. Today's discussion will be moderated by Professor Vasanthi Srinivasan from IIM Bangalore. And it is moderated and it is organized jointly by iSPIRT, which is the Indian Software Product Industry Roundtable, and IIM Bangalore's NSRCEL, which works with entrepreneurs. We want to ensure that we bring cutting edge ideas to India and help Indian companies, Indian startups become world-class. And I think this seminar couldn't have come at a more opportune time, because Bob talks of full spectrum thinking, and it seems, to quote Tagore and Gitanjali, that we are kind of, being divided into narrow domestic walls. The incidents that are happening in the US right now, what's happening in India, the promise of the internet was that, we would have free sharing of knowledge. Instead, it seems that we are herded into narrow corridors of thinking. So I think, how do we kind of build full spectrum thinking? What is the impact that it can have on our society? How can we use full spectrum thinking to solve challenges like climate change, etc., which cannot be solved through super specialization or through very siloed, narrow thinking? I think these are the kind of issues that we will examine. And so with that, over to you, Professor. And I'd also like to thank my very dear friend Charles Assisi, veteran journalist and technology and business writer, for joining us today. He is himself a full spectrum thinker, and some of his blogs, etc. I hope he'll talk a little bit about some of the work that he has done and some of the blogs that he has written. Over to you, Vasanthi.
Thank you, Venki, and it is absolutely a pleasure to host this Global Leadership Seminar on Full Spectrum Thinking with Bob Johansen. In a little while, I'll come back and share why it's doubly special for me in many ways. But what I thought I would do before we begin is to actually set the agenda on what's going to follow for the next hour and 30 minutes. We're going to begin with a presentation by Bob, followed by question and answers. And my request to the audience is that just keep putting in the questions. Just be focused and sharp and keep them short so that it allows us to take more questions. Okay. So continue to do that right through the presentation. And after Bob's presentation and Q&A, we will quickly hand over the floor to Charles Assisi. And as Venki has already introduced him, but there's just one thing that I want to leave with you. He is a co-founder of the Founding Fuel, a media and learning platform. And apart from that, some of the writings are extremely reflective and insightful. And it is that dimension of that insight that Charles will bring, in some ways, reflecting on what Bob has presented. And after that, I will give a little bit of time for Bob and Charles to be in conversation. And then we will open up the floor for the audience again, on the chat with a few questions, and then we will wrap up the session. Okay, so that's the agenda. Now, let me just go before I introduce Bob. And I have been, it's truly an honor for me to be hosting this session. And when I was asked to do this, I didn't even hesitate for a second. It didn't matter to me what was on my schedule, because here was someone whose work I have followed since 2009. Okay, so I just want to share a little bit of a snippet on how much I know of his work and how little he knows of me still. Is the fact that in 2008, I was actually struggling when during the financial the financial crisis, a large bank came and asked me, how should they prepare their leaders for the future? And this is in the midst of the crisis. And I wondered what it is about leadership development that I had done in the past would actually be relevant for them. And with this in my head, I'm walking past the airport bookshop, and I'm headed to Delhi, and that's 2.5 hours by flight. And what do I see and pick up? I just pick up Bob's book on Leaders Make the Future. And in that 2.5 hours, the penny just dropped for me, because one of the interesting things is, he said, how do you do dilemma flipping? And that's it. It just fell in place. And then I went on to work with them for several years. And after that, I just forgot about it. And then again, come 2016, NASSCOM asked me if I would do something on future-ready leaders. And here I am still grappling, just did my field work and came back. And what happens? Bob decides that he has to write a book for me. And what do I see there is new leadership literacies. And the whole idea of hindsight and foresight, insight and action, I think that framework has just stayed with me. So you can now understand why this seminar is so special in many ways. Okay? Thank you so much, Bob, for making this happen for me. And it's a pleasure to have you. And before I hand over to you, I'm going to ask you one question, which I'm sure several people in the audience are also waiting to listen to, is what is a futurist? What does a futurist do? And anything at all that you can introduce yourself as a futurist as you go get into your presentation. Thank you so much for being on this seminar.
Sure. Thank you, Vasanthi, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. That's my hope, is that my books have that kind of impact on people. So I am what you would call a humble futurist. Futurists have a bad reputation of being quite arrogant and loving to make other people feel stupid. I'm not that kind of futurist. I focus 10 years ahead, though, and I have been doing that now for 40 some years. The Institute for the Future is the longest running futures think tank in the world. So the first question you always need to ask a futurist is, have you outlived your forecasts? Have you outlived your forecasts? We have, and we're usually right in the sense that we actually keep track. Out of those 50 years, 60 to 80% of our forecasted futures have actually happened, depending on your definition of happened. But it turns out that's not the way you evaluate a futurist. That's the way you evaluate a fortune teller. The way you evaluate a futurist is, does his or her foresight provoke your insight? It doesn't really matter if you agree with the foresight or not. It only matters if you're provoked by it. And indeed, sometimes, like some of the forecasts we've done right now in global climate disruption, I hope do not happen. In other words, it'll be a success if it does not happen rather than if it does. So our job as futurists is to provoke other people's insight and other people's action and help them make wiser, more thoughtful, more humane decisions. But that's the way I see it. I resisted for years calling myself a futurist, but I've given up now. And I do call myself a futurist, but I usually say a humble futurist. I'm going to talk today about full spectrum thinking. We'll send you links afterwards about how to get discount copies for the books if you want to. We're an independent nonprofit, and all the proceeds from my books go to our nonprofit leadership development work, like what we're doing here today. So what I'm going to do here is give a little bit of history. So Vasanthi talked about Leaders Make the Future, and I know a number of people on the call have used that, the new leadership literacies, and then the new book, Full Spectrum Thinking. It's a trilogy, and I didn't realize when I started writing it that I was writing a trilogy. It all started when I was asking myself pretty much the same question that Vasanthi was asking herself: what will it take for leaders to thrive in the next decade? And I happened to be, I'm not a military guy, but I happened to be at the Army War College, the graduate school for the military, the Army in the US. And I learned about this term VUCA, VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I got really intrigued with what does that mean and how can we be more prepared for this radically VUCA world. And I'm now involved in a documentary film that'll come out next year on VUCA, and my voice is kind of the positive VUCA. So I started bringing executives to the War College, and I started writing Leaders Make the Future. And the 10 skills, which I'll share with you just in a moment, the 10 skills I think are the skills we need, but skills aren't enough. It also takes literacies or practices or discipline. And that's the second book. And the third book is mindset, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And the positive VUCA, as I've called it, is the framing of this. So volatility yields to vision, uncertainty yields to understanding, complexity yields to clarity, and ambiguity yields to agility. So those are the fundamentals. It's going to be a VUCA world in the negative sense. And if we can flip that into a positive, that's the way to make the world a better place. So these are the skills that were articulated for the first time in Leaders Make the Future. We're doing several projects now at the Institute, one of them for WPP, the world's largest ad agency, on the talent profile for the future. And this is the profile we're starting from. And I've highlighted the two most important, and Vasanthi's already introduced dilemma flipping. And a dilemma is a problem you can't solve. It won't go away. But you have to figure out how to win anyway. And by win, I don't just mean I win, you lose. I mean, how can you win in a way that creates a new commons, a new kind of reciprocity advantage, if you will. And dilemma flipping, I think, is the most important characterization of the next decade. And clarity is the most important way of engaging with the dilemmas. And the lesson from this, and I'll repeat this several times, clarity is be very clear where you're going and very flexible how you get there. That's how you win in a VUCA world. Very clear where you're going, very flexible how you get there. And the military has all this language about this, and I can share that. It's described in detail in the book. So we don't have time to talk about all of these skills here, but just beginning on the left side, immersive learning. I talk a lot about gaming, and I hope we can come back and talk about this. I know gaming is very big in India, and the kids have a competitive advantage. We just did a new study on the future of video gaming and interactive entertainment. What we think of as video gaming today, 10 years from now, that's going to be the most powerful learning medium in history, because we have to learn in immersive, engaging ways. And we've got these digital interfaces now that are so much more powerful. And the gaming world's way ahead of us in business. So I want to at least highlight learning and immersive learning. But commons creating, I mentioned that. The maker instinct, that ability to make and grow things. Bioempathy. We need a new sense of affinity with nature and affinity with biology, including our own bodies. Again, the lower left, rapid prototyping. Fail early, fail often, fail cheaply. That's our motto in Silicon Valley, and certainly in Bangalore too, from what I gather. constructive depolarizing. It's such a polarized time right now. And we see it here in the States, the events of the last week, the frightening events of the last week were so polarized, so polarized. So we have a lot of certainty here, but not much clarity. Smart mob organizing. What we saw last week was not a smart mob, it was a dumb mob. What we need is smart mobs that organize for public good. And finally, I don't think that arrogant styles of leadership are going to scale, are going to work in a large scale. You need strength and you need humility. So we can come back. I'll share all of these slides with you. And again, I'll give you links to get a discount copy of the book if you want. This is the second book in the trilogy, New Leadership Literacies. And I'm going to talk in particular today about the core literacy, looking back from the future, but acting now. And again, Vasanthi did a very nice job of introducing the Foresight Insight Action model and how that can work. In the upper left, Voluntary Fear, that's how I've begun thinking now about immersive learning and gameful engagement. You have to take your fear, simulate it, game it, and then allow people to immerse themselves in it. So the military, again, it's way ahead of us in business. They call this wargaming, and it's the most powerful way to learn. In the upper right, shape-shifting organizations, hierarchy, command and control basically doesn't work in the VUCA world. It only works in more stable, more predictable times. So what we need is that ability for leaders to lead from behind, to be servant leaders, to help grow the shape-shifting organization where hierarchies come and go. In the lower right, being there without being there. So many of us have realized this in the shelter-in-place rules globally, but we've been talking about this for years. We have to be as good when we can't be there physically as we are when we're working in person or virtual. They have to be equally good, and we have to be there without being there. And finally, we've got to create and sustain positive energy. We need to be leaders. We need to be healthy physically, healthy mentally, and even spiritually. We're not necessarily religiously, but spiritually in the sense of being grounded to face the VUCA world. And my background, I went to divinity school and studied world religions. I've always been very interested in your religion and spiritual traditions in India. And I'm not an advocate of any brand of religion, but I'm a student of world religions. And I did that before I went to my PhD program. My PhD is in sociology, but I grew up in Silicon Valley. So I've really followed tech, and I'm usually the human side of a tech project. And then finally, here's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm just going to introduce this now, full spectrum thinking. It's the ability to make sense out of the future. Remember I said, be very clear where you're going. The ability to find that clarity across gradients of possibility while resisting the temptations of certainty, the temptations of mindless categorization, the temptations of thoughtless labeling. And you're seeing this in India now, as I look from the outside in. We're certainly seeing it in the United States as I look from the inside out. We're labeling each other. We're categorizing each other in very simplistic ways. And that's very dangerous in a VUCA time. So categories coerce. So categories aren't bad if they're accurate and if they're fair, but so often they aren't. And we particularly have to resist the binary categories, either this or that, black, white, resident, immigrant, gay, straight. These binary categories get us in a lot of trouble because in most situations are not binary. And unfortunately, our computing architecture, and so many of us, are digital, our architecture, our way of thinking boils down to zeros and ones. That's the past of binary computing, but that's not where we're going. Our brains want certainty, but the future will require clarity. So our brains play against us, and there's a lot of neuroscience in this book. Our brains want to predict, our brains want to categorize, our brains are looking for certainty, but you can't have it. You can't have it. We need clarity, but certainty is very dangerous. So here's the forecast that came out of the new leadership literacies. The future will reward clarity, but punish certainty. So sure, certainty gets rewarded in the short run. You know, that's why autocrats rise into power. But autocracy, fascism, I don't believe it's scalable in this world, because anything that can be distributed will be distributed, and the future will reward clarity but punish certainty. Many are certain, but few are clear. Now, I told you I just went to the Army War College for the first time the week before 9/11. I started volunteering there, and I brought executive groups there. I brought 15 different groups there over the years of CEOs, of senior executives, of people like you in this audience. And I've gradually become part of their teaching now. And my current assignment is I teach the new 3-star generals, and there's only 42 of those at a time in the US. I teach the new 3-star generals on their first week in Washington. They read this book just like you're reading it. And what I've tried to empathize with them as they arrive in Washington, D.C. right now. And I don't talk about politics. I'm focused 10 years ahead. But I can't help but notice in Washington, the politicians of both sides, the Democrats and the Republicans, most of them are certain, but not clear. And that's just really weird for the military people, because they know you need to be clear, but it's dangerous to be certain. So now bring in full spectrum thinking, and that's interesting. Okay. Full spectrum, the future will reward full spectrum thinking, but punish categorical thinking. So I hope we can come back to this in the conversation. This is debatable, but I'm convinced that my direction, my clarity is correct, and I'm happy to share it with you today. So here's the kind of simple view, bridging into digital, since I know so many of you are deeply digital, probably more so than I am. Yesterday's tools for categorizing, that's traditional binary computing. That's what we all grew up with. But tomorrow's tools are so much better. Big data analytics, visualization, machine learning, blockchain, which I define as distributed authority computing, gameful engagement. So these tools are much more full spectrum and not your sort of forced choice binary computing. Ultimately, we're going to quantum, but that's going to be beyond the 10-year horizon. But that's clearly beyond binary and clearly full spectrum. So the direction of change here is really obvious. And the reason I'm so optimistic, and Venki was pointing out as we were just getting started today, this is a really optimistic book in a very pessimistic time. And the reason I'm so optimistic is the tools of full spectrum thinking are getting so good, so practical. You don't have to be a techie to benefit from these new digital tools. So that's the optimism. And I'm particularly optimistic about kids who are growing up digital. And I'm optimistic about them if they have hope. So our job as digital immigrants, those who are more than 25, our job, even though I grew up with the internet, I didn't get involved in it till I was in my 20s. If you get involved really early, like in your early teens, that's when it shapes you the rest of your life. And those kids, we call them now the cross reality natives, 15 or less. The digital natives are 25 or less in 2021. So here's how it works. And this gets back to Vasanti's comment, and it'll give you the model, and we can talk from there. I just want to present for a few more minutes, and then we'll go into more conversation mode. And again, I invite you to send your questions through chat, and Vasanti and Venki will do some curating for me. So Foresight is a future back story that includes signals to bring them to life. And we're big believers in the William Gibson insight that the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. So we call those unevenly distributed futures, we call those signals, and they're all around. And we have a global database of signals that we track. And we're looking, so Foresight is not a prediction, nobody can do that. It's a future back story that's plausible, internally consistent, and provocative. And to go back to Vasanti's question about what's a futurist, that's a futurist. So a futurist is a person who creates these future back stories with signals to bring those stories to life. And the purpose of that foresight is to provoke your insight. And an insight is really important. An insight's so much more than an idea. An insight is an aha that creates a new story in your brain. And once you have that story, you can't unsee it. You can't go back. You can't go back. So insight is precious. Insight is scarce. And insight, it's particularly useful to use foresight to provoke insight, even if you don't agree with the foresight. And ultimately, the purpose of this is to use that foresight to provoke your insight that leads to your action. And the action is an agile way forward, expressed with clarity, and ideally as a story. So again, very clear where you're going, very flexible how you get there. And notice how story appears at each case, because our brains are wired for stories. If our brains don't hear stories, they make them up. They make them up. So we gotta be great storytellers. We gotta be great storytellers. So notice that the story from the future is a story from the future back. Right now, we don't do that. You know, most of our companies, particularly big companies, they do now, next, future, or present forward, or the horizon model. I think this tracks to McKinsey, Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3. It's a good way of thinking about strategy and planning if you're in a stable world, a kind of linear, more predictable world. But we're not. We're in a VUCA world. So what you need is just a flipping of the order. And this is part of the dilemma, flipping. You need to think now, future, next, or future back. So you can still do the horizon model, just change the order. So go Horizon 1, Horizon 3, and then Horizon 2. Now, people often say to me, how can you do 10-year forecasting? I can't even do 1 or 2 year forecasting. Well, the reason is because it's easier to do 10-year forecasting. So here's an example, very relevant to the group and what we're talking with today. 10 years out, it's obvious we'll have sensors everywhere. They'll be very cheap. They'll be interconnected, many of them, and some of them will be in our bodies. That's just obvious 10 years out. What's not obvious is how do we get from here to there? So if you think future back, you say, whoa, we're going to have ubiquitous sensors 10 years from now. What should we be starting now? What should we be prototyping? What should we be thinking about and beginning to work on? So let me give you one example, and then we're just going to take a few more minutes here. One example of future back thinking in business, and I know a lot of you are involved in startups and in organizations, so let's talk specifically about organizations. So here's the foresight, 10 years out, future back. Future organizations will be more shape shifting, less command and control. That's just obvious. No, I don't think anybody would debate that. And command and control works in calm, predictable, straightforward times. And if you can find one of those, go ahead and be command and control. It's just really hard to find them. So that's the foresight. The insight is what we call now organization charts or org charts, these kind of rigid, structured things. And even jobs will need to be more fluid, will need to be more adaptable. That's the insight, the aha. And the action is, again, you got to be very clear about direction, but very flexible about execution. That's what I hope the big takeaway is for you today, is very clear about direction, very flexible about execution. So let me spell this out for you in more detail. This is what I mean by a shape-shifting organization. And this is the org chart of the future. It's not rigid. It's very more like a fishnet, and the hierarchies come and go, and it grows from the edges. So there's no center, more distributed authority, more distributed governance, less centralized. The hierarchies are still there, but they come and they go. Liquid hierarchy, liquid data, liquid organizations. They grow from the edges where diversity flourishes. And it's an unfiltered kind of full spectrum diversity. Excuse me, and it can't be controlled, but it can be guided. So I showed this graphic to the CEO of a very large company. And this was before the shelter in place. And I was in his very large office behind his very large desk. And I flipped my laptop around and I showed him this graphic. And he leaned across at me and he said, "Where do I sit? Where do I sit?" And I said, "Well, you're not at the top anymore. You're at the foundation. And you are the source of clarity. CEOs are still really important. Boards are still really important. They are the source of clarity. But the hierarchies come and go. So the military talks about flexive command, where you're continuously reevaluating who's in the best position to make which decision at what time, based on your discipline of situation awareness, based on your ability to do what they call after action reviews. So the hierarchies come and go in a kind of pulsating way. And this is what the org chart of the future is going to look like. You'll get a herky-jerky animation here through Zoom, which is appropriate. This is a prototype we've done in Vive in virtual reality. These are avatars, are real people. We've done this for Cisco to prototype their human resource organization of the future. Each color has a different meaning for full-time employee, for associates, for gig workers and various others. And you can move around in the space and kind of rearrange the org chart. So, I call this an animated org chart prototype. And finally, this is the last thing I want to show you. This is how I'm thinking about human-machine interfaces. And it's kind of a normal curve, but if you think about all the way to the left here, it's humans only, and all the way to the right, it's machines only. So humans assisting humans on the left, machines assisting machines on the right. And this is a spectrum. So it's a full spectrum of humans and computers. And this is what I want to prompt our conversation with, is this spectrum. And we already have on the left side, on the human side, that's human resources, or HR as it's come to be called. I love the term human resources because it's even more important in the future. Human resources. I like to say it with a pause, human resources. I don't like the term HR. It's been devalued, outsourced, routinized, and it's not very digital. The HR people now tend to be not the strategic thinkers, not the digital thinkers, but it's an important function, and it's going to get even more important in the future. On the right, on the tech side, we have IT. And again, IT, I don't particularly like that. Information technology, I do like that. It's information and technology. And then Tom Malone's new book. Tom Malone is a professor at MIT, and this amazing new book called Superminds, which I recommend highly. And what Tom says is, it's true that if you look 10 years ahead, we'll have some automation where computers will replace humans, but that's not the big story. The big story is humans and computers doing things that have never been done before, never been done before. And that's what he calls a supermind. And we don't have a new model of that, but in the new book, I've got a whole chapter on the future of human resources. And I was trying, just as I prepared for this, to imagine, well, what are the models of superminds that we have out there? And here's a model. And I think Mr. Spock and Star Trek has carried over to India. It's a certainly global pop phenomenon that started in the late 60s with Leonard Nimoy played him. I've just recently watched a documentary about Mr. Spock, is a great documentary done by his son. And you remember Mr. Spock was a Vulcan from another planet, but he was a product of an intermarriage of Vulcan and human. And he functioned without emotions. So he was like a blend of a human and a computer. And I put him kind of right in the middle. Maybe he leans toward IT in the sense that but on the other hand, his emotions are always leaking out, especially in his interactions with Captain Kirk and with McCoy, Dr. McCoy. So we're going to have new models of this, but we have to think in a full spectrum way about this is basically the future of AI. I don't like the term artificial intelligence. I think that's the worst term for an emerging technology that I've encountered in my career. It's held up the evolution of symbolic computing by at least a decade. And as I look back at this literature, you know, the term was coined 68 years ago now. And there was a debate at the time whether to call it artificial intelligence or augmented intelligence. They made the wrong choice. They went with artificial intelligence, and it set up this really bad discussion of computers replacing humans instead of how can computers augment humans. Superminds, I think, is a much more powerful idea. So I'm going to do the pause here. I'm going to come back to life without the PowerPoints and open the conversation, see what questions we've gotten through chat. And we're a little ahead of our plan.
Bob, you have a full spectrum of questions.
Oh, great. I was hoping so.
So I've got them here. And Venki, if I miss something, you can kind of bring. So let's begin with a little bit of, on the future of democracy, do you think it will shed some of its drawbacks and evolve into something more sustainable?
Yes, I think that's the quick answer. I think democracy needs to be thought of as a shape-shifting organizational structure. And what democracy needs to thrive is great clarity of direction. So we need leaders with vision. So go back to that positive VUCA. You need vision. This is a time where vision gets disproportionately rewarded. You need understanding. We need leaders that listen. We do not need leaders that shout. Listening is much higher priority than shouting. We need clarity. We can't have certainty. And again, so many of our politicians are certain, but not clear. And then finally, we all have to be agile. We have to be corporate athletes. We all have to be very super healthy and mentally healthy and spiritually grounded. Again, not necessarily religiously, but having some sense of meaning. And I'm very influenced by the latest Blue Zones work, and you'll see Blue Zones referenced in both of my two previous books, the last two books. Blue Zones is the project which looked all around the world at the places where people live the longest, healthiest lives, but die the quickest. So, you know, it's what we all want. We want a long, healthy life, but then die quietly in our sleep. What happens in America is with our healthcare system, we're really good at heroically preventing death. We're not very good at healthy living. You know, so what we tend to have is these kind of rather unhealthy lives and then very uncomfortable extended deaths. But the latest research out of Blue Zones is that people who have a purpose in their life tend to live up to 7 years longer. They're happier, they're healthier. People with a sense of purpose in their lives who also work for a purpose-driven organization tend to work up to 14 or live up to 14 years longer. Again, and the companies tend to perform better. So that, to me, that's the essence of the growth equation for democracy. Now, let me say the other side of that. I don't think fascism is scalable in the VUCA world. It works in the short run, and we're seeing examples all around the world. It won't scale because the fundamental forecast under this, and I talk a lot about this in the new book, the fundamental forecast is anything that can be distributed will be distributed. And that's, the internet is packet switching. It's that kind of shape-shifting infrastructure. Anything that can be distributed will be distributed. So command and control, autocracy, fascism, even systemic racism, I don't believe that will scale. It'll work in the short run because people are so confused and they need a simple answer. I don't think it'll scale. This is debatable, but that's where I come down.
Okay. So I'm going to pick the second one, which is on which of the 5 future leadership competencies can be used to address the corporate immune systems. What if someone is clear and certain? Would it amount to arrogance? And there's one person who's asking you to just clarify what that voluntary fear, what does that mean?
Voluntary fear, okay. So voluntary fear means you take whatever it is you're afraid of and you immerse yourself in it in a low risk way to practice ways of responding. So this is the root of wargaming. I got to visit the Army War College's National Training Center, which is in the Mojave Desert. And I came to think of it as the world's largest video gaming parlor. It's about the size of the state of Rhode Island. It has real tanks, real actors that are very realistic, real helicopters, and people play games there with sensors on all around. They play games for 2 weeks, 24 hours a day, and most lose to the A team, the home team, the enemy simulator, and many people are killed without having to die. That's very powerful learning. That's what I mean by voluntary fear. You immerse yourself. Now, it's harder to do in business than it is in wargaming, but that's what we need to do, voluntary fear. So go back, what was the first part of your question again, Vasanthi?
Yeah, which of the 5 future leadership competencies can be used to address corporate immune systems? Then how do you, yeah.
Yeah. Corporate immune system. So all corporations have immune systems. So the beginning of the conversation is to set your expectation. And if you think future back, it's like looking at your organization in a mirror. So the thing about corporate immune systems is they're often invisible until you run into them. And if you look future back, they become more visible. And if you set the expectation that it'll be a VUCA world, you can see that you have to be more shape-shifting and you have to resist being held back by these immune systems that aren't ready for the future. So you just set up a process of foresight, insight, action to dialogue. The future back view makes the immune system more visible. And then you need to engage with it and say what parts of that immune system are still valid given the future back view and what parts need to change. But it's not going to happen overnight. It has to be an iterative process of foresight, insight, and action. So I would say the core literacy, the core competency that's most relevant is thinking future back, but acting now and building that into your discipline. Now you need simulation and gaming to do that, and you need shape-shifting organizations to do that.
Okay. So let me pick a couple of other questions. Can you touch upon which function is best suited for developing future back, given the short tenure of the CEOs and the pressure on short-term results? And secondly, where do new business models fit in future bank thinking?
Yeah. So I think what you need is cross-functional teams. So there's no single function that's most important to this. I think a cross-functional team, what you really, everything has to be digital. So, so for sure you need, but it can't be a separate digital. It's got to be an integrated digital. Everything has to be savvy from a human resource and an organizational change point of view. So clearly those two things have to happen, the blending of digital and organizational change. And then I think it's a new business innovation model structure that you want. And the mantra we repeat in Silicon Valley all the time is fail early, fail often, fail cheaply. So you have teams that are going through these cycles in a continuous way, and failure is rewarded as long as it isn't stupid failure, making the same mistake over and over again. Like some of the failures that have been made recently by the social media companies, those were stupid failures because they should have learned this a long time ago. But on the other hand, had that continuous learning loop. That's really important. So I should have said too. Yeah, just one more thing. When you look 10 years ahead, you always look at least 50 years back. So it's basically 60-year swaths of time is our typical business angle, because almost nothing happens that's truly new. Almost everything that happens was tried and failed years before. So what we currently call social media was prototyped in the 70s. In the early days of the ARPANET, before it even became the internet. The internet started in 1968. It was publicly introduced in 72. The World Wide Web was early 90s. So what we've got so far, the history of the internet, all the way back to 1968, it's basically the world's largest market test for what's going to happen next. But if you're going to do the what's next, you got to look back too. So you look future back, but then you also look 50 years back going forward. And sometimes, depending on the topic, sometimes you look even further. We did a forecast on green health, kind of human natural green health. We went 200 years back because it was so important. We did another project recently on the future of food security, and we went 30 years ahead in that one to get beyond the polarities of the present around GMO foods. Because there's a lot of sincere people who think GMO foods are a yes/no choice, a binary choice. They're not. Food chemistry is a spectrum of choices. And some of those choices are good, some of them are bad. If you go 30 years out, you can see that. But 10 years out, we're still stuck in our blinders.
And let me do my last question, and then Venki, I'm going to hand over to you. This question is about how much trade-offs would be needed between generalists and specialists in flexible hierarchies in the future, and what kind of skills do you think will be in demand, and is skill really required in the future?
Is skill really required? You mean, what do you think they mean by skill there?
I think it refers to a little bit the things that help you to get better in your regular business as usual. Something that can be applied and see the results are obvious in short-term horizon.
Got it. Okay. So in the VUCA world, the deeply digital, deeply scientific, very fast information changing world, specialization is very dangerous because you don't really know quite what the specialization tracks are. So in Silicon Valley, we use the term T-shaped people, like T like that, cross and down, T-shaped people. Tim Brown, the CEO of IDEO, is the first person I heard talk about that. But certainly in design and certainly in futurism, T-shaped people is what we look for. People with depth. So we really honor academic training and honor deep knowledge. But the problem with most PhDs is that you go so deep that you don't have the breadth. And when I came to the Institute, all of the leaders were PhDs. now, there's only a few of us who are PhDs who are left. We did hire just a new PhD. We're not against PhDs. We like them. We'd like to hire more, but we don't want them to be so deep that they can't think laterally, or they can't think across the top of the T as well. So that's what you need organizationally. You need technical depth, but you need people that bridge that depth, the kind of T-shaped personalities. And leaders, it's really too late now to do a digital strategy for a company. It's just too late. Digital is too pervasive. Now what you need is a strategy, a business strategy that includes digital. And everybody has to be digital, including the CEO. So it's just digital's everywhere. It's gotta be, it's gotta be. But it's so important that 10 years from now, we won't even have the word, the word digital will be gone because it's just so obvious. I wrote a book called Groupware in 1988. Nobody talks about groupware anymore because it's just what our computers do. This is groupware.
Venki, over to you.
Yeah, so I think we've got a lot of questions, and I just want to pick up one question before we request Charles to come in. And I like this particular question because this is from Rajiv Maheshwari, who asks, the brain tends to categorize. How can we fight the anatomy of the brain to think in a new way? And the reason I'll quickly explain why I like this question, because when it comes to investing, for example, behavioral investing is becoming, an important discipline. And it's very hard when you try to kind of explain to people why they should invest early. The benefits of compounding is something very, very hard for people to understand. Similarly, the kind of future back thinking, full spectrum thinking is again a mental discipline that needs to be built up. So how do you build your muscles for this particular kind of thinking?
Yeah, it's a great question. So neuroscience is becoming practical over the next decade. And what we all need to do as leaders and as futurists and as organization entrepreneurs, we've got to know our brains better and understand better how our brains function and how to play into that in constructive ways. The best single source for this, I think, is the Neuro Leadership Institute out of New York, David Rock's group, NLI. Maybe we can put that in the chat, in the link. And David has a concept called SCARF, SCARF, and put that in the chat too. Just Google SCARF and David Rock and you'll find it. But it kind of breaks out the basic functions of what our brains do. And it's very helpful. David and I did a session together right after the kind of pandemic outbreak. And then we did another one just recently with Amy Edmondson from Harvard Business School about psychological safety. So we brought in full spectrum thinking, psychological safety, and neuroscience. And you can find those on their website too, those webcasts. And to me, the basics, I did the keynote at the Neuro Leadership Institute in New York 2 years ago, and they had a neuroscientist follow me everywhere. And every time I talked, the neuroscience would interpret. So for example, I did an opening talk, the opening keynote, and I talked about what we were just been talking about future back and foresight, insight, action, and you can't predict the future. And my adult supervision, who is a great neuroscientist, Kevin Oxner from Columbia, when I said you can't predict, Kevin said, well, that's true, Bob, except that our brains do it anyway. Our brains are always trying to predict. They're trying to predict what's going to happen next to keep us safe. And we get these fight or flight kind of reactions. We get stimulation that's satisfying for certain kinds of behavior, but our brains are always trying to predict, and our brains are always looking for certainty. So essentially, we need to teach our brains new tricks. So they can keep us out of trouble, but we also need to think thoughts we've never thought before. So to me, the the answer, Venki, is neuroscience is critical. I've got lots of references to neuroscience in the Full Spectrum Thinking book, but I think referring to David Rock and the Neuro Leadership Institute, that's where they've focused, is exactly on this question.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
There's one interesting question, Bob, and after that I'll hand it over to Charles. How will leaders get exposed to the kind of ideas that you're talking about, and how do you see organization structures change?
Well, as far as how leaders get exposed, they read my books. I think the games that they play are important. The kids that they have around them are important. I think cross-generational learning is one of the most powerful change agents for organizations now. And I've got a whole chapter in the new book about digital natives and about these cross-reality or XR natives. And again, my definition of a true digital native is 25 or less in 2021. So it's not the millennials. The millennials are too old. They're not really digital. Well, I mean, they're digital, but they didn't grow up digital. So I'm interested in the kids that were starting to become adults in 2010. And that's a big threshold year because of the iPhone and the iPad. 2020 is going to be a threshold year too, because of Zoom, because of shelter in place, because of so many things happening all at once. So I think those are, the kids are so important in this. I think cross-generational learning is critical. I'm really interested in the 15 or less, today's teenagers, and Greta Thunberg, the famous kind of climate activist, she's a little older than that, but there's lots of Greta Thunbergs out there, and they're growing up very knowledgeable. Maybe we can put a link on. I just did an interview about full spectrum thinking with a group called Futurist World, and they were intrigued with my chapter on digital natives, and they said, would you mind if we invite an XR native to talk to you in our podcast? So they invited a 10-year-old who's actually, his family's from India, and they live in Australia now, and his name is Om. O-M, and he's 10 years old, and he was great. He was great. We had this wonderful conversation, and he's so far beyond where I was when I was 10 years old. He's thinking globally already, and I think these kids, and part of the reason why they have this advantage is they grow up as gamers, and for parents, those of us who are parents, or I'm a grandparent now, there's reason to be concerned about today's video games. Some of them are too sexual and too violent, but the medium is what I'm interested in. And that's the power. It's such a powerful learning. So those would be my responses as to how to engage.
Yeah. Bob, there are several questions out there. I'm going to hand over to Charles, and maybe we pick a few of them for the closing comments. Over to you, Charles.
That'd be great.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Vasanthi. Bob, it's been absolutely brilliant listening to you. And even as I was listening to you and reading your book over the last 2 days, I've been thinking about it, and I've been making some notes and reflecting about it over them. And some thoughts have stayed with me basis what I read and what I've been listening to. And one thing that is, what I heard you say is to create and sustain something positive that stays with me, and I think that is something which we need deeply. And the other thing that the times we live in right now, it is so important that we stay positive. And the other thing that is that resonates very deeply with me is how important it is for us to tell stories, because that is something that our brain needs so much. We are hardwired to do. And on reading your book, there are 3 learnings that stayed, that emerged for me. And I just want to share those learnings with you as I was kind of thinking, reflecting upon it. And I want to use 3 stories to share those learnings. So the first thing that stood out for me was don't focus too early. That kind of stood out for me. And this stood out for me because, in a very Indian context, most of us in India, we begin to, we are told to start focusing very early. And this is very counterintuitive to what you have articulated. And this emerges in the part where you have that interaction with Peter Drucker. And I highlighted that very specifically in my notes where you made the point that Peter Drucker spoke to you about. And if I may just read that passage out, I highlighted it very specifically. He told us for the first half of your life, you should try out many different kinds of work and make it a point to work with many different kinds of people, since you won't yet know who you are or what you want to become. Try out a spectrum of possibilities, he taught us. And for the second half of life, Drucker said, you should only work on things you are passionate about and only work with people whom you love to work. Focus is good, he said, but don't focus too early. Now, if I may share a personal narrative, Bob, in my case, I was told that I should become a doctor, and my brother was told that he must grow up to become an engineer, because we are regular Indians, and in regular Indian families, at best, the limits of our ambition is to join the civil services. But I flunked, and I stumbled into journalism, so I'll spare you the details. But as things come back, assuming for a moment that, if I had gotten into medical college for a moment, if I were to hypothesize, what would life look like right now? I mean, where we are right now, what we know currently is that, when I was looking at the data, what we just know is that, the amount of content, the rate at which knowledge is exploding. Medical knowledge doubles every 72 days. Or if you take a field such as civil engineering, in just a few months, a civil engineer, for instance, in their domain, engineering knowledge is outdated. And then on the other hand, we have a situation where our lifespans are increasing. And we can safely assume that most of us who are in our late 40s or early 50s, we will easily live into our 90s, and the digital natives that Bob spoke of will very safely live to be 100 or more. And so if the half-life of knowledge is increasing and our lifespans, if the half-life of knowledge is shrinking, so to speak, and our lifespans are increasing on the other hand, it is inevitable then that, we have to prepare ourselves to go through these multiple shifts in our careers personally. And this is something that emerged for me in your book. But when I think about it, is this something that we are preparing ourselves for? I certainly don't get that impression when I look around. And when I think about organizations that I engage with, how far out into the future are they thinking? There were very few examples that I could think up. I really couldn't think about it. I mean, say, for instance, Bill Gates had spoken about the pandemic in 2015 at a TED Talk. All of us applauded the TED Talk. Most of us did. But how many of us took it seriously at that point in time? And from, all of us know now that the ground beneath our feet has shifted. It has fundamentally altered. And the point you made that, all we know about the future is how to get there. So by way of a metaphor, my colleague Kavi Arasu, he drew a metaphor in the early today morning on our call, is that what we know is that the world has changed, and there is a difference between a scooter that is powered by petrol and a scooter that is powered by electric, and an electric scooter. So we we certainly know that there is a difference. There is this means of transport, but how to use it is something we don't know. But we do have those tools there. We have to figure our way around that. But this is something few leaders at organizations, very, very few leaders at organizations are willing to acknowledge. So as I was going over the chapters in your book, that is another thing, that another insight that kind of emerged. And from that thing, learning number two, lesson number two that stood out for me was, that the best leaders, they prepare for the future. And by way of example, there are two stories that I can share off. Was that when I got into journalism, one narrative that stands out for me is that in a very Indian context, ICICI Bank, when I got into journalism in the 90s, very early 90s, used to be thought of as a very staid place, and not too many people had heard of it as a retail bank. And then comes in Mr. K.V. Kamath, and I'm not sure, Bob, if you may have interacted with him, but most of us in India are very familiar with him. And as a journalist, as a writer who was reporting, I got a chance to interact with him. And he was talking about ATM machines, internet banking, digital, way back then at the turn of the century. These were things we had not heard of. But he was a man who could see the future. He could visualize it. And the clarity with which he articulated it was astonishing. And what I liked about it was, each time I'd come out of a session with him, I felt energized, I felt positive. The other person I can think about is Nandan Nilekani, for instance. When I was reporting on Aadhaar and India Stack to write the book, even while I knew that this whole thing is happening, for instance, it took me a long while to wrap my head around the fact that Indians will actually use their phones to transact digitally, to make payments digitally. But he knew that this is going to happen, and he could actually visualize it, and it happened. And even as this pandemic happened, that is what kept us going. And they could see the future, they could align their people to it, and they could bring the best out of them. So that's the other thing that has stayed with me. And as I was reading your book on the parts where you speak about leadership, that is another thing that kind of stayed with me. That the best leaders who lead their organizations, they can see the future, they can craft the future. And the third thing that stays with me, Bob, while going over your book, is that I am a digital immigrant, and I need mentoring from digital natives. And you have made that point, and that I must have the humility to accept that mentoring. And let me give you two examples. There is at my organization, my colleague, there's my colleague Anmol, for instance. He's much younger to me. He was born probably at the time I graduated from college. But when the pandemic happened, and when we were all compelled to move into work from home mode, he was the technically savvy person. Now, I always thought of myself as technically savvy, but in the transition that happened, now had it not been for someone like him, it would have been, to make that transition as seamlessly as he did, it would have been impossible. It would have been really, really tough. You've also made some you also made the point about how fundamentally digital natives are very different from digital immigrants such as me, because they place a premium on experiences, and companies will have to understand that, and to craft the future, to craft their strategies around that. And just to test that assumption, if that may be true, I just kind of went around to I tried a thought experiment with my daughter a little earlier today. And I asked her, if I give you rupees 50 lakh, that would be about 50 lakh would be 5 million. Would that be correct, Vasanthi? Yeah. And I offered her that option. I told her, this is a choice I'm offering you, and here's a choice between buying a home or travel the world. What are you going to do? She said, I'm going to travel the world. I said, okay, what about buying a car or renting one? And these are options you highlighted in your book. And she didn't bat an eyelid. And she said, I'm going to rent a car. And I asked her why. And she said, because I'll appear rich. And I'm going to get an upgrade every 6 months. But for me, it was very different. It was very important for me to own a car. That I must have a first car. I must have a first home. All of this was very, very important to me. Now, how am I to deal with this? How am I to transition to this mindset? How am I to deal with all this? This future is this is not a future that is going to happen. This is a future that is here and now, and it is happening, and the pandemic has just accelerated it. And for that, I need coaches who are digital natives. And the future is happening faster than I can cope with. But on listening to you speak and on reading your narrative, net, I did not feel down, because the point you made on VUCA, I was, as opposed to uncertainty, I was left feeling very, very positive. And these were the thoughts I was left with at the end of your talk and on reading your books, Bob.
Good.
Thank you. Over to you, Bob. Anything that you want to kind of build on based on what Charles said, and then I can pick up some more questions. Please.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Charles. That is very thoughtful and very helpful. I think, let me just build on what you're saying rather than going through point by point, but I really appreciate your way of thinking about this. Since the book came out, since Full Spectrum Thinking came out, another book came out that I wanted to reference here. It's called Lead from the Future, and it's by Mark Johnson. And Mark is the co-founder of a consultancy called Foresight that Clay Christensen founded. So he's one of Clayton Christensen's students at Harvard. And I met him a few years ago, and I got to work with Clayton before he passed away on a custom forecast for Southern New Hampshire University. And I didn't know anything about Southern New Hampshire University. It's SNHU. But if you Google them and look at their annual report, you'll see the custom forecast that we did that looked at the college student of the year 2030. And what Mark Johnson is trying to do in this book fits so well with what I'm trying to do in Full Spectrum Thinking, where I go foresight to insight, Mark goes insight to action. And we're now working together to do a master class on Full Spectrum Thinking with GSK, the big pharma company, and their digital leaders. But the story Mark tells in here fits very well with, Charles, what you were talking about someone who could see the future. And this is a kind of a dilemma as a futurist. In general, I believe that with most companies, they do not have people who can see the future with great clarity. They've got to explore their way to that future with a kind of continuously refinement. That's what I mean by be very clear where you're going, very flexible about how you get there. A few companies, and I mean a very few, have that great clarity of direction. Like Steve Jobs, you could argue, had that. And Mark gives the example of how when Steve Jobs came back to Apple, he said very clearly, we're not going to be a computer company. We're going to be a digital appliance company. And we're going to set up this network hub model, including music and including telephony and a whole series of other things. He had that vision. And, you know, Steve Jobs was not really a futurist. He was a prophet in the biblical sense. And it was interesting. I was working with Apple at the time, and we worked with the Advanced Technology Group. We were doing futures work with the Advanced Technology Group. He wasn't particularly interested in our work because he knew the future. He was prophetic. And he's one of the most prophetic people I've ever been around. But there is a difference between a futurist and a prophet. You know, a futurist thinks about alternative futures, and that's what most of us have to do. A very small number of people have that prophecy. And Alan Kay, when he was at Xerox PARC, said, it's easier to make the future than it is to predict it. And certainly Steve Jobs believed that. Now, final quick story. Mark tells the story of Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, and we're also working with Microsoft right now. And when he became the CEO, he described the culture as a know-it-all culture, a know-it-all culture. And he said, no, we can't be that in this VUCA world. We've got to be a learn-it-all culture, a learn-it-all culture. And they're now using full spectrum thinking, and they use my earlier book. They've got principles of leadership that are very consistent with the skills I talked about in the literacies. But they're clearly in a learn-it-all culture now. At Procter & Gamble, this is called the fastest learner wins. The fastest learner wins. Now that's different than the prophetic strategy. So if you're lucky enough to have a prophet around, most prophets are wrong. so you got to have a prophet who actually has a credible future that you're willing to bet on. Otherwise, you've got to have that cycle of foresight, insight, action to reduce what futurists call the cone of uncertainty. The prophets don't care about the cone of uncertainty. They know the answer.
Bob, it's interesting that you mentioned Microsoft because I spent many years fighting Microsoft and saw it at very close quarters. And I think what really struck out was the immense amount of arrogance that they had. And then, Satya came in and he changed the organizational culture. And one of the things that I see, there's a whole bunch of Indian CEOs of tech companies, and I see a shift from very intensely IQ-driven organizations to, adding a little bit of EQ. And in the book that, in your book also, empathy seems to come out as a really important quality. Unfortunately, our education system, our business systems, and our engineering education heavily focus on IQ rather than EQ. It's almost as if EQ doesn't exist at all. So, can you say a little bit on that and that shift from IQ to EQ, or a balance between IQ and EQ?
Yeah, so I agree with what you said. You need both the IQ, the kind of core intelligence, and particular digital intelligence, and the emotional intelligence. That's why I say understanding, that ability to listen, that ability to empathize, that ability to understand. That's really, I'm actually, while I'm really interested in prophets and, prophecy, I'm really skeptical about it too. I mean, because mostly prophets are wrong. So you've got to be really careful of prophecy, and you've got to be very careful of arrogance. On the other hand, in the dilemma flipping skill, what I say is you've got to like the space between judging too soon. That's the classic mistake of the prophet or the problem solver, and deciding too late. That's the classic mistake of the academic. So you do need to decide, even in a VUCA world, you do need to decide. But you've got to be careful not to decide too soon. And that's what I see around in our polarized politics right now. You've got politicians that really aren't listening. they're just shouting. And that's really dangerous at this time, unless you're one of these prophets who actually has it right. But most of them aren't, and it's hard to tell till after the fact.
Bob, there are 3 questions around social good, societal. I think they may have some something for us to hear. First one is, all that you have said, how will it help in dealing with the kind of inequalities that we see around us?
So this is in the front end of full spectrum thinking. I talk about 3 big looming issues over the next decade, and the rich-poor gap is one of them. It's my biggest concern right now is the growing gap between the rich and the poor, and the pandemic has made it much worse. It tends to affect poor people much more unfairly and much worse. It affects people of color much worse, and it's really a big issue, and it's getting worse. It's hard to do a 10-year forecast where the rich-poor gap gets better. It's easy to do a forecast where it gets worse. So it's my biggest looming concern out of this. The other 2, incidentally, are related. One of them is global climate disruption, and the pandemic links directly to global climate disruption. And you're right, Bill Gates said this in 2015. And so we did have advance warning. We just didn't pay enough attention to it. And then the third was cyber terrorism, and that's linked directly to the rich-poor gap. So in a real sense, the rich-poor gap links to everything that I've talked about so far, and it's the biggest looming concern. So what we need to do is to think. We've got a whole group at the Institute that focuses on what we call equitable futures. And you can find it on our website, and you can look. We're doing work with the state of California on the future of work. And there's a lot of pressure now around the definition of a job, and how that links to healthcare and retirement planning and those sorts of things. Those are really big looming issues that have to be a top priority. They are dilemmas. Within those, there are problems that are solvable, but they're really big dilemmas that we just have to keep chipping away at. And there are some good encouraging things about trying to think through social assets, not just corporate assets. So there's things to be encouraged about, but this is my biggest concern is the rich-poor gap.
So may I just come in here for a moment on that point you just made on social assets? What is your experience like? I could see you spent quite a bit of time on that part, that there must be a premium that organizations and people must place on social assets, else they will be penalized. Are you seeing, this is your experience and interactions, are you witnessing any fundamental changes out there?
I am, and I mean, you can argue that it's not going fast enough, but it's going faster than I expected. There's quite a few efforts underway now in the business community to think about social assets, to think about social good, and to link that to strategy. And for example, in the climate disruption area and in the diversity area, there's things that are going faster than I had thought in a good way, but it's still a very big looming challenge. But I do think there's some intellectual work to be done to try to think through social assets, not just financial assets, and how those are distributed and how they're tracked, and how we assess whether our societies are working or not.
I think this, in the interest of time, we can take maybe one question. And Bob, this question also is my question too, is that what kind of behavioral changes are needed in individuals, and Jay was also talking about it, are required in individuals that actually get us to focus on the future of greater good. What is it? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this notion of future back is critical. I think my next book is going to be a children's book, and I'm really interested in how kids think about the future. And I am convinced that kids are natural full spectrum thinkers until we categorize it out of them. And I think kids are naturally interested in the future till we pull back and kind of constrain them to say, well, you got to get a job, and you got to do this, or you got to do that. So the challenge is, how do we engage this next generation of young people? Because again, I'm really optimistic about them if they have hope. If they have hope. If they don't have hope, they become dangerous. You know, they could get recruited by terrorist groups. They could be depressed. They could be suicidal even. So there's risk around this, but there's such great opportunity with kids. The other thing I'm really interested in, there's a Native American principle, and I've seen elements of it in different world religions too, that the people who are closest to God are the kids and the elders. The kids and the elders, and the people who are the farthest from God are those that are at the height of their earthly careers. so in a way, I'm really interested in those younger than 25 and those older than 65. So the older that, you know, we have the license to play the wisdom game, you know, so you can play that, but the kids have the license to play digital games, and they're way ahead of us on that front. So I'm really interested in cross-generational, and I'm really interested in how kids perceive the future. So that's my current thought. And I've actually got a meeting with my publisher this week about a possible book that could be geared toward elders and seniors that's designed that they can read it to kids. So there's the essence of it is future back. You know, what if you think of the world future back rather than present forward? You just make very different choices if you think future back rather than present forward. The present is so noisy, you know, particularly now, it's so noisy. But if you go future back, there's a cleansing quality, there's a clarity quality, there's a humility, there's an empathy that you just don't see, and it creates a very different mentality toward daily life.
Yeah. Thank you, Bob. Thank you so much, because I think we don't talk enough about the cross-generational, intergenerational legacy. I think we've stopped talking about legacies. You know, we're talking of intergenerational conflicts, multi-generational challenges, but really the legacy of kind of creating and sustaining things for the future, which are more powerful than what it is that we have actually got ourselves. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to leave the participants with some really great insights from today's session. And the first one that I'm going to actually start with is your reframing of VUCA. And leave people to take back, saying vision, understand, clarity, agility, so far away in the world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. The second one, I loved it, and I wish that not just as a futurist, but as an academic, and I'm sure all the others who are attending there, provoke action to make more humane decisions. I thought that was such an insightful statement from you. Provoke action to make more humane decisions. Yeah, I think very, very insightful. How do you flip the negatives. As a leader, how do you flip the negative to look at the positive? And that kind of ties into the whole idea of positive energy. How do you create and sustain? And I think one of the things I'm discovering, particularly during this COVID, is how contagion, of positive energy, how much when you see relief work that happens, volunteers giving their time, effort, and energy, there's a certain contagion to it. And probably we don't tap it in a positive, healthy manner as much as we could do. The other one that I loved was be clear where you're going, but be very flexible on how you're going to reach there. I think that is kind of going to stand us in good stead just thinking about it. The other things that the challenge between judging too soon and deciding too late, I thought that was another one. But the one that kind of has left me really thinking is the point that you were making about digital natives, and particularly the context that, and in some ways I'm asking this question, what have we left the digital natives with? And I think the last chapter in your book that you're talking of inequality, cyber terrorism, and climate related impacts, how then do we actually look at shape-shifting of attitudes? And I think the question that I want everyone in the audience to go back with is saying, what is it that we as digital immigrants need to do as shape-shifting to actually be able to create that spiral for the digital natives, if that's so natural to them in the way it comes across? Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob, for this wonderful, insightful session. Thank you, Charles. Again, great insights. And I'm so glad that you had these insights for the audience. And what can I say? I just have to thank three people, Jay, Venki, and Karthik, for just supporting us through this entire session. And thank you so much. And over to you, Venki.
Thank you. Thanks, Vasanthi. I think you were a wonderful moderator with a tremendous amount of enthusiasm. So very happy that you were able to take this up. Bob, what do you say? What can I say? I think this has been a wonderful session, and I first have to thank Jay, because it's through Jay that we got in touch with you. And when Jay suggested that you could be one of the speakers at the Global Leadership Seminar, we immediately jumped down to that, because at iSPIRT, the work that we do is very future back. We think 30 years ahead and then try to imagine, what does it take to enable financial inclusion? What does it take to, build digital infrastructure that enables, small ticket, low cost loans at the most affordable cost possible? And how do you build this entire ecosystem which enables end-to-end kind of cashless, presenceless, paperless transactions? So the full spectrum thinking that you spoke about and the future back thinking that you spoke about is something that we try to practice on a daily basis. We may not always have a theoretical framework, but the work that you do, provides us a great framework for that. So thanks, Jay, for connecting us to Bob and being a great mentor for the Global Leadership Seminar. Thanks, Bob, for your insights, and thanks, Charles, for joining us, because I think I read your blog post on the Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, and how he has a degree in philosophy and computer science, and how he put that together to create Facebook. And that's something that's very rare in the Indian context. People who do computer science do not do philosophy. People who do philosophy do not do computer science. And I think that was a great example of how that synthesis of philosophy and computer science enabled the creation of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. And I'd also like to thank Sharad, because he gave me the opportunity to be the curator for this particular this series of seminars, because our first one was with Professor Alex Osterwalder, who's the author of the business model canvas, and his recent book was on the invincible company. And I think what Bob is talking about is building, a future-ready, resilient organization. And I think these are all part of a spectrum of knowledge that we have been able to bring to Indian audiences through the Global Leadership Seminar.